Hello, I'm Ed Fuquay, young adult librarian extraordinaire here at Woonsocket Harris Public Library.
Solitaire for my children's room.
We're here to have another conversation, talking about various exciting topics. We've been talking about mythology lately because storytelling, fairy tales, and mythology are part of the theme of the summer reading. Last time I discussed Mesopotamian mythology, the myths of ancient Babylon, and I left off on Gilgamesh.
You did.
Gilgamesh is one of the big guns of world mythology. He's kind of an amazing character. For one thing, his stories are roughly 4,000 to 5,000 years old.
Okay.
So the story of Gilgamesh is the oldest story in the world.
So are there multiple variations of it?
Yes, it was recorded over a period of several hundred years, probably several thousand years. There are a couple of fragmentary stories about Gilgamesh that don't quite fit into the main narrative, but enough chunks of clay tablets have been found to assemble an almost complete life story of Gilgamesh.
Wow.
You can write it so that it reads like a novel, which is exactly what this guy did. Stephen Mitchell wrote a recent adaptation of Gilgamesh. This is very highly regarded by the critics, some critics anyway. The only two things to bear in mind is that in his introduction, he makes a lot of parallels between the ancient Middle East and the American invasion of Iraq, which was taking place at the time he was doing this.
Okay.
So many people thought that the modern reinterpretation of some of the old stories, it wasn't necessary really. He also focuses a lot on the erotic element of the myth, and there certainly is a lot of sex in it, but that wasn't the main focus of it. Now that is a children's version of Gilgamesh, which has no sex in it whatsoever. However, they also toned out a little bit of the violence. However, it's really good. It's extremely well written. I highly recommend it. But yeah, the fact the story of Gilgamesh can be told and retold in so many different ways. Gilgamesh has been a play, an opera, a comic book series. He's been the basis for so many heroes. The story of Gilgamesh was put down in a clay tablet at least 1,000 years before Homer wrote the Iliad or the Odyssey, but it very clearly influenced them. You can see the beginnings of the Western concept of the hero from Western civilization and so forth. So much so, in fact, that brings us to Joseph Campbell. Are you familiar with Joseph Campbell at all?
I don't believe so.
Yes, well, I will make you familiar with him. We couldn't talk about mythology for very long without mentioning Joseph Campbell and Hero with 1,000 Faces. My wife was already asking, how come we didn't mention Joseph Campbell? And she's absolutely right, because Joseph Campbell is at the heart of almost any discussion of mythology. I read a lot of Joseph Campbell, I like his work. He invented the idea of the monomyth, which is the idea that all of mythology is basically one story, told by different people all over the world. And we're just seeing various ways of looking at it through the lens of different cultures.
I like that.
It's all one story. Joseph Campbell was enormously popular. He wrote tons of books about mythology. Every screenwriter in Hollywood for a long time had a copy of Hero with 1,000 Faces on his bookshelf, because this is a model that was used for pretty much every action adventure movie or fantasy movie. At least half the fantasy books you read. George Lucas, when he made Star Wars, was huge into Joseph Campbell. They corresponded. You can follow the beats of Luke Skywalker's life all the way through every step of the Hero with 1,000 Faces. So yeah, to say Joseph Campbell was influential is an understatement. He was amazing. If I'd known he could actually make a good living just writing and talking about mythology, I would have gone for that for a major when I was in school. I had no idea until Joseph Campbell came along I could actually make a good living doing that. So anyway, he has come into some criticism lately from anthropologists since he's passed away. Among other things, although he studied world myths from all over, he mostly focused on Western mythology because that's what he was most familiar with, and he comes from a Western culture. And his monomyth doesn't work as well the further you get from Europe. When you get into the Middle East and the Far East and so forth, it doesn't quite fit as smoothly as it does with almost every other story. Joseph Campbell was absolutely right that human beings are pretty much the same all over the world, and they all ask the same questions. Where do we come from? Why do we have to die? What's it like after we die? Every civilization asked those questions and came up with different answers. And so the fact that we see those answers reflected in the myths of the people. But the myths of Europe influenced Campbell much more than myths of anyone in, say, Africa or Asia, which don't fall into his categories quite as smoothly. But almost everything else does. Remember when I said last week that you'll be hearing from that again? There's several things in Mesopotamian mythology that are kind of laying the groundwork for several other religions that haven't come along yet. This predates Greece and having Greek mythology and things like that. Babylonian mythology was kind of concurrent with Egyptian mythology. The Gilgamesh story is the oldest story in the world. The pyramid texts that were found wrapped around mummies are actually older, but they don't tell the real story. They're instructions on what to do in the afterlife. So they don't have a plot, or a beginning, a middle, and an end, like the story of Gilgamesh does.
So his story that was found on these tablets,
Yes.
do the tablets present it in a way that is, and I don't know I've read it, but I don't recall the facts of the story. Is it presented in a way that it is fictional and in a myth, or could this have actually been an actual person?
He almost certainly was an actual person. These are stories told about him. His name is listed on a list of kings in what seemed to be a historic document.
Oh.
He found enough things from Babylon, and certainly after he became a legendary hero, his story was told and retold all around the world. There are references to him in almost every corner of the world. So almost everyone on Earth at one point knew this story.
So what made him a hero?
Well, so again, it's a long story. He was probably a real person. He's the oldest person in the world whose name that we know.
Oh, no.
Yeah, which is kind of amazing. He was the king of Uruk, which was a city that eventually became the heart of the Babylonian Empire.
Are you saying
Uruk, U-R-U-K is how it's spelled in English.
Oh, okay.
That eventually became part of the Babylonian Empire. So it's in Babylon that these stories were first written down.
Which is not the same as you are.
It's very similar, yeah. They're part of the same civilization.
Geographically the same space?
Yes.
Okay.
He was the king of Uruk. He was 2/3 god and 1/3 man. Yeah.
Alright.
Trying to figure out the mathematics of that has puzzled scholars for a long time. But the ancient papyrus assures us that he was 2/3 god and 1/3 man. Apparently at that time, the gods so frequently lay with mortals that almost everybody had a little bit of God in him. And somehow his mother and his father produced him, yeah. In the beginning, he was not a good king. He abused his people. He forced them into these huge construction projects to build things to glorify him. In some interpretations of what the cuneiform says, he actually would use his ability as king to test out all the women before they were married. Very, very bad thing.
Was that prima nocta?
Yeah, it was something that supposedly was continued on to the Middle Ages, but in real life, no one sure how often it happened. And again, even this is a 4,000-year-old clay tablet, so no one really knows. But anyway, he was not considered a good king. In fact, he was such a bad king, people prayed to the gods for relief. And so the gods decided that they would do something to help the people. So they created a person to defeat Gilgamesh.
Okay.
A creature was created whose literal job on Earth was to defeat Gilgamesh.
I thought you said a person. Person or a creature?
That's a good question. That's kind of at the crux of the matter, because they created a creature known as Enkidu.
Okay.
Now, Enkidu was a wild person who lived in the woods. In some versions, she has a goat's hooves and horns and things like that.
Okay.
As a kid, I always imagined him as like Tarzan. He lived with the animals, he could talk to them, and so forth. He was a wild man who would raid farms, steal livestock, destroy crops, and things like that.
Okay.
Now, Enkidu and Gilgamesh serve the purpose of being like mirror opposites. Gilgamesh is the king, Enkidu lives in the woods and smashes things. Gilgamesh builds things, Enkidu smashes things. This gets into what Carl Jung would several centuries later call the shadow self. A real hero's arch enemy is always his opposite number, which is in fact himself. Your true enemy is always yourself. That's why all the great heroes of fiction have been opposed by someone who is exactly like them, by evil. Holmes and Moriarty, the Doctor and the Master in Doctor Who, Reed Richards and Doctor Doom and the Fantastic Four, are each mirrors of each other.
Okay.
So Enkidu was created as the literal mirror of Gilgamesh, deliberately made as powerful as Gilgamesh. But he was even more out of control than Gilgamesh. So the people decided that they still needed relief because now they had two problems to worry about. So the answer came in the form of Shamat. Shamat, whose name translates as the luscious one. She was referred to as a courtesan in some texts. Yeah. Yes, even in the children's version, they have to draw her like that because, see, Shamat, the luscious one, she may very well have been a temple prostitute who served Ishtar, because Ishtar certainly had them. Anyway, she was the best at what she did. And so she went out there to do the one thing no one else could do, which was tame Enkidu.
Okay.
What she did. She met him, they hit it off right away. In fact, they kept hitting it off for 7 days and 7 nights, continuously. And when they were done, she led him to a farm. He was fed beer. He never had fermented beverages before, and bread. He never had baked food before. He'd always eaten his food raw. And when Enkidu was finished, he wanted to go back to the woods again, but all the animals suddenly ran from him. And he realized he couldn't talk to the animals anymore, who all shunned him, because the animals had seen him with this mortal woman and seen him eat human food, and they knew now that he was a human rather than an animal. So they wouldn't accept him anymore. So he was cast out of the paradise that he lived in and had to make his way in the world. So, Shamat is a fascinating character. She only plays a small role in the legend, but she's still the earliest woman in mythology who's not a goddess. She's just a temple prostitute as far as we know, but she was really smart. And she taught Enkidu how to, wear clothes and go into civilization and not cause too much of a ruckus. In ancient times, apparently in Babylon, they thought that prostitution was one of the cornerstones of a civilized society. So Shamat represents that civilizing influence that some women have over some men.
Interesting.
She literally makes Enkidu from an animal into a man and leads him back into the city again. So he comes back to the city, and one of the first things he encounters was Gilgamesh, who was having his way with a woman who's about to be married. So Enkidu instinctively knows that this is wrong and immediately attacks Gilgamesh. And the two of them fight. Huge fight. Gigantic fight. It goes on and on for a long time until they realize that they're so evenly matched that neither one can beat the other. So they decide, rather than knock over the whole city fighting, Superman and General Zod in Man of Steel, they decide to settle their differences, and they have no choice to make peace with each other and become brothers. They actually go to Gilgamesh's mother, who adopts Enkidu, so they actually become literal brothers. Wow. And then, like guys everywhere, they decide to seal their friendship by going and killing a demon. It was a bro thing, yeah. So they went out to kill the demon. The worst demon in the world was Humbaba. If you spoke Assyrian, you'd be shaking right now, because Humbaba was apparently a really horrible name back in the day. Humbaba was a gigantic demon, incredibly powerful, horns and fangs and gigantic, the whole 9 yards. He was a real monster. He had terrorized the land for years. No one could defeat him. So the two of them go, and this is where the story of Gilgamesh starts to get a lot of fun, because they actually take time out of the legend to go into the hero's inner thoughts. He and Enkidu, before they face Humbaba, have to psych each other up by telling each other basically how cool they are. Gilgamesh and Enkidu actually get cold feet facing Humbaba and have to talk themselves into it.
Understandable.
Understandable, yeah. But again, you don't see this for the most part in like Hercules or Thor or any of those stories. Also, Gilgamesh grows and changes, which the other heroes don't do.
Emotionally and mentally.
Yeah, you'll see that to come. So they attack Humbaba and they defeat him. And they come back, huge celebration. Gilgamesh and Enkidu are brothers. They're blood brothers now. They've been bonded by combat together. Now, they run into the goddess Ishtar, who offers herself to Gilgamesh. And he turns her down for a couple of reasons. He casually mentions like her last husband she sent to live in the underworld, which we talked about last week when Ishtar was called Inanna. In fact, in the cuneiform, he actually goes into a list of the bad things she's done to previous guys she chose as a companion. None of them ended well. Well, Gilgamesh doesn't want to join that parade of people who've been changed into bugs and stepped on, so he turns her down. This makes her really angry. You don't get Ishtar angry at you. So she goes to Golgotha, the bull of heaven. Now, remember from last week, Golgotha, the bull of heaven, was married to Erekashai, her sister, the goddess of death. So she asked her brother-in-law to step in. And so, sure enough, Golgotha comes down to earth. He's a giant bull. He starts rampaging, smashing things, goring people with his horn. So again, Enkidu and Gilgamesh go to war against this monster that's menacing Babylon. Huge fight, and they win. They defeat the bull, and Ishtar appears to berate them for killing such a noble creature. And Enkidu responds by ripping off one of the legs of the bull and throwing it at Ishtar. Oh yeah, it's bad.
Does it get worse?
Yeah. Well, Ishtar now goes to the rest of her pantheon and says, okay, these guys have gone too far. And we have to put a stop to this. They're arrogant, they're offending the gods, she's personally offended, and so the king of all the gods decides to strike one of them dead. And they kind of do an eeny, meeny, mighty, mo thing, and they choose to kill Enkidu. So Enkidu immediately becomes sick and starts to fade away, starts to wither away. He loses his strength, he's bedridden, and Gilgamesh is beside himself. His only friend in the world is dying, and there's nothing he can do to stop it. The cuneiform goes on and on with his lamentations. He wailed like a professional mourner at a funeral, it says in one of the lines.
Is that a thing?
Yeah, they hired
Professional
mourners.
mourners?
They hired mourners to make a lot of noise at your funeral, just in case not enough people actually cry. They have professionals who would come in and do it for you.
Who and when and where?
In many civilizations, but apparently they did in ancient Babylon too. They kept doing it throughout, like Italy, and I know Ireland did it for a while. It was a thing. They had professional mourners. So yeah. So after Enkidu is dead, Gilgamesh can't deal with life
He
anymore.
does die.
Enkidu dies. Gilgamesh cannot save him. So Gilgamesh winds up wandering the earth and trying to figure out the meaning of life, essentially. He realizes if Enkidu can die, then he can die. Because everyone dies. And what's the point of being alive if you're just going to die? So he wanders the earth trying to find some meaning to it all. At some point he decides that he wants to be immortal, so he can never die like the gods. And so he sets out, that becomes his quest. And so he crosses the whole face of the earth. At one point he goes through a mountain pass, which is guarded by a giant scorpion monster and his wife, also a scorpion monster. And so they've been appointed by the gods to like block the pathway. If you've seen the second Mummy movie, I imagine the monster the rock becomes in the end is pretty much with the scorpion guy that Gilgamesh faced.
The scorpion reminded me of Alien, actually.
Yeah, he was a scorpion. But anyway, they're blocking the way, he and his wife, and they demand to know who Gilgamesh is and what he's doing there. He tells them his entire life story, and the scorpion monster essentially says, dude, I'm a scorpion monster, but you have it harder than I do. So they let him pass. So he wanders into the wilderness beyond the ken of mortal men, and he wanders into a bar, as one does. Yeah. And inside is Siduri, who's another fascinating female character from Babylonian mythology. Siduri is a goddess, and she's apparently the goddess of, there they are, scorpion monster. Siduri is apparently the goddess of brewing, but perhaps the goddess of wine, depending on how they translate certain cuneiform. It's often described as brewing, as she makes beer. So she draws up a nice cold one, or at least a nice room temperature one for Gilgamesh. And he tells her his story, and as a good barkeep, she listens to him sympathetically, and then gives him really good advice. It's like, Gilgamesh, don't worry about being immortal. Everyone is born to die, and that's okay. That's how it's supposed to be. You should concentrate on living a good life. Wear nice clothing, get married, have some kids, watch the sunset with your wife on the porch. All really sound advice that Gilgamesh just is not in the mood to hear. He's determined to find the answer to life. And so he leaves the bar and wanders some more. Eventually, Siduri does tell him where to go for the next stage of the journey. He has to pass through into another world where someone lives who is a survivor of a great catastrophe. Now, you know the story where God floods the earth and destroys all living things except for one guy and his family who survived with some animals on a boat? And that guy's name is?
No.
Yes, except this is a story that comes before Noah. When the Babylonians told that story, his name was Utnapishtim. Utnapishtim is the earliest flood story we have on record. And you'll see flood stories again and again and again throughout mythology. So much so, some scholars believe there actually was a massive flood at some point in this part of the world. So, he goes to Etnapashtim, who is immortal, having survived the flood, and asks him how he became immortal. Now, they go through a whole rigmarole, but he sets up challenges that Gilgamesh doesn't meet, and he tells Gilgamesh about a plant that will make him eternally young, but Gilgamesh loses it to a snake. That's why snakes shed their skin. They actually become younger when they do that. Little known fact. When snakes shed their skin, they actually become a younger version of themselves, making all snakes immortal, unless you run over them with a car or something like that. That's what the Babylonians believed anyway. So he goes through all this and still fails to become immortal. Now, Utnapishtim tells him more or less the same advice that Siduri did. You know, that you have to be a better person and live a better life. That's the secret to life. And so he gives up on all this and wanders back to Uruk. And when he gets back to his city, he sees how much it's changed. Everything seems different now. But the real moral of the story is the city's the same, but Gilgamesh has changed. Everything that Gilgamesh has seen and done has changed. He's a different person now. In a lot of ways, he's a better person. He doesn't go back to those huge building projects, forcing everybody into slave labor. He doesn't bother with other guys' wives. He gets married himself, starts a whole dynasty of Babylonian kings, and settles down to lead a good life. He's a very different person at the end of his adventure. In one of the clay tablets, it closes with the line, "He passed through the darkness and saw the light."
Very cool.
Which is really, really super cool. His story is a complete story, and it's 5,000 years old from ancient Babylonia, punched into clay tablets with cuneiform markers. It's an amazing story, and it's the basis of a lot of the heroes of Western civilization that we'll get to later. What do you think? Gilgamesh.
You know, I was aware of Gilgamesh, like I said.
Yeah,
I've
he's famous.
read one of the shorter children's versions, but I'd definitely like to take another adult
Yeah.
look at it. That's all very...
The children's one right there, Gilgamesh the Hero, by, what's the author's last name?
McCaffrey?
McCaffrey. It's really good. They take out the sex and a lot of the violence, but the actual story of Gilgamesh's life is very well told.
I mean,
There's a lot of different translations.
still so relevant,
Yeah.
is where I'm intrigued and would want to take a closer look.
Well, as Joseph Campbell pointed out in his books, everybody asks the same questions of the world, and we
Yeah.
all seek the same answers. And how we seek them and what we do to go through that, that's the life journey. You know, all of us aren't great heroes, but all of us are on a journey. And the hero's journey is our journey, the path that we take through our lives.
Do you happen to know what Gilgamesh means?
I'm not sure. I honestly don't know. It's probably in one of these books somewhere. There's a dozen different translations. I just happened to pick like this one because our library has it. There's a version by a woman to take kind of a feminist slant on it, which is easy to see because there's so many powerful female characters in there. You can look at it in a million different ways, but it's still the story of Gilgamesh, who's like the oldest story in the world. Now, what amazes me about the story is, as a storyteller, the first time I heard the story, you know what I thought? Well, Gilgamesh, you did become immortal. You've been dead 4,000 years and we're still talking about you. That's the only immortality human beings ever had, to be talked about after you're gone.
Yeah.
So maybe Gilgamesh did become immortal after all.
I love it.
Thank you for joining us. Until next time, I have been Ed.
In Solitaire.
Be safe, and we'll see you again on Conversations.